The entire auction house went quiet the moment the violin case was opened on the appraisal table. 3 senior conservators leaned in, then leaned back. One of them actually laughed. Not unkindly, but the way people laugh when they want to soften something devastating. The lead appraiser from the Whitmore Institute, a man who had spent 30 years restoring instruments for symphonies across Europe, set down his magnifying loupe and delivered his verdict without flinching. Irreparable. Flood damage to the spruce top, the internal block split clean through, the varnish dissolved beyond recovery. He said it would cost more to attempt a restoration than the violin had ever been worth at its peak. He said the kindest thing anyone could do was let it go. Standing at the edge of the room in a grey wool coat she had worn to her own mother's funeral the previous spring, Catherine Aldrin listened to every word without moving. She had driven 4 hours from Halifax to get here. She had taken 2 days off work she couldn't afford to miss, and now she stood holding a cardboard coffee cup that had gone cold an hour ago while a room full of experts explained, in careful and professional language, that the only thing her late father had ever truly loved was beyond saving. Then a voice came from the far end of the work table. Quiet. Almost apologetic, the kind of voice that clears its throat before speaking in a crowded room. May I have a look? Nobody paid much attention at first. The man who spoke was sitting on a stool near the supply shelves, partially blocked from view by a rolling tool cabinet. He wore a canvas work apron faded to the color of old mustard. There was sawdust caught in the cuff of his left sleeve. His hands, when he stood and moved toward the table, were the hands of someone who had spent a long time working with them. Not rough exactly, but careful-looking, deliberate. The lead appraiser glanced at him with the particular patience of someone who has explained things many times to people who were not in a position to understand. The instrument has extensive internal fracturing, he said. The label inside reads 1887. Even if the wood could be stabilized, the tonal integrity is. I know what the label reads, the man said. He wasn't rude about it. He was already crouching slightly, looking at the violin from the side without touching it. I've seen this luthier's work before. He used a double purfling technique on the back plate that most people miss. Can I pick it up? Catherine said yes before she had time to think about whether it was a good idea. His name was Leonard Voss, and in that moment, inside that cluttered conservation room in a building that smelled of linseed oil and old paper, almost nobody in the room understood what they were actually witnessing. Leonard Voss had spent most of his adult life in a small repair workshop in Truro, Nova Scotia, in a converted garage behind a hardware store that his father-in-law had owned and eventually signed over to him after the old man's knees gave out. The shop had no proper sign out front, just a hand-painted board that said, Estrement. Repair with the second word slightly crooked, because Leonard's daughter Pip had helped paint it when she was 7 and he hadn't had the heart to redo it. She was 11 now. She came straight to the shop after school most days, dropped her backpack on the orange vinyl chair by the space heater, and did homework while her father worked. People in Truro knew Leonard the way you know someone who has always been there, dependably, without fanfare. He fixed things. Guitars with warped necks, cellos with cracked ribs, fiddles that had survived house fires and basement floods and decades in unheated attics. He charged fairly, sometimes too fairly, and he was slower than he probably needed to be because he refused to rush anything he didn't feel confident about. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. His truck was a 2009 Ford Ranger with a heating system that worked on its own schedule, and his shop coffee maker had been duct-taped across the handle for so long that the tape had become structural. But Leonard Voss had once been something else entirely. Before Truro, before the hardware store garage, before the hand-painted sign with the crooked second word, Leonard had been a graduate student in musical instrument conservation at Dalhousie. He had published 2 papers before finishing his degree, one on pre-Confederation fiddle construction in the maritime provinces, one on the use of hide glue versus synthetic adhesives in spruce plate repair. He had been accepted into an apprenticeship program at a workshop in Montreal that trained restorers for institutions. His supervisor had told him, with genuine feeling, that he had the kind of hands and the kind of patience the work required. That he could have a real career doing this at a serious level. Then Joanna got sick. It happened fast, the way those things sometimes do, What seemed like fatigue turned into a diagnosis, and the diagnosis was worse than anyone expected. And within 14 months of that first appointment, Leonard had buried his wife in a cemetery outside Truro in November, with Pip standing beside him in a coat, 2 sizes too big, because they had bought it large so she could grow into it, and she hadn't finished growing yet. The Montreal apprenticeship dissolved. The papers stopped. The academic path closed not with any dramatic announcement, but simply by running out of time and money, and the emotional capacity required to do anything except keep Pip fed and in school, and reasonably convinced that the world was still a place worth inhabiting. Leonard's mother-in-law Adele watched Pip on the days Leonard worked. He worked 6 days a week. He came home tired in the specific way that grief makes you tired, not sleepy, exactly, but hollowed. The repair work kept him sane. That was the truth of it, though Leonard wouldn't have said it that way himself. He would have said he just needed something to do with his hands in the evenings. But the people who knew him understood that the workshop was where he went, when everything else felt impossible. Late at night, after Pip was asleep, he would sit under the fluorescent light and work on whatever was in front of him. And, for a few hours, the world contracted to the width of a maple rib, or a brace, and that was exactly as large as he needed it to be. He was at the Whitmore Institute that week, only because a community orchestra in Dartmouth had sent him 3 instruments for repair, and one of them, a student cello, with a detached bass bar, needed a humidity-controlled environment he didn't have at his shop. The Institute let independent restorers use their facilities on a case-by-case basis. Leonard had been working quietly in the corner of the conservation room for 2 days. It spoke to almost no one. And then Catherine Aldrin had walked in with her father's violin. He held it now with the careful formality of someone handling something sacred. Turned it slowly, brought it close to his face and looked through the fefholes with a small flashlight. His expression was the kind that gives nothing away, which made the conservators in the room slightly uneasy. People who don't know what they're looking at usually show it. Leonard didn't show anything. "The top can be rehumidified and closed," he said finally. "The block is split, but it's a clean split. It didn't shear. That's the difference between a repair and a reconstruction. This is a repair." The lead appraiser from the Whitmore made a sound that was not quite disagreement, and not quite agreement. "The varnish," he said. "I know," Leonard said. "The varnish is gone on the lower bout. You can't recover that exactly, but the original recipe for this maker's finish is documented. There are 2 instruments with confirmed provenance in the collection at UNB. I've seen them both. The color match won't be perfect, but it'll be close." Catherine had stopped breathing normally somewhere around the word rehumidified. She pressed her cold coffee cup against her sternum, like it was a compass. "Can you actually do it?" she asked. Leonard looked at her for the first time with his full attention. He had an unremarkable face, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that you have to look at twice to remember. But there was something in the steadiness of it that was hard to look away from. "I don't make promises on instruments I haven't fully opened," he said. "But I don't think this is done." Catherine drove back to Halifax that evening, with the violin case in the back seat and Leonard's phone number written on a receipt from the Institute's vending machine. She wasn't sure what she had agreed to. She wasn't sure Leonard was sure either, but she had watched him hold that violin, the way her father used to hold it, like it weighed more than it actually did, in the best possible sense, and something in that had made it impossible to leave without saying yes. The violin had belonged to Gordon Aldrin, who had died 8 months earlier at 74, in the hospital, in Halifax, after a stroke that came with very little warning, and took the rest of him before anyone was fully prepared. Gordon had not been a professional musician. He had been a machinist for 30 years, then a foreman, then retired, and throughout all of it, he had played fiddle every Tuesday and Saturday, at a kitchen party circuit that spanned 3 counties. He was not a formally trained player. He had learned the way a lot of people in Cape Breton learn, by ear, by watching, by sitting in the same room as people who were better than him, until he wasn't worth anymore. The violin was not worth much in any financial sense. A local maker had built it in 1887 for a ferry captain in Pictou County, and it had passed through 4 or 5 sets of hands before Gordon found it at an estate sale in the late 1980s for $60. He had it set up, replaced the pegs, put new strings on it, and proceeded to play it almost every day for the next 35 years. By the time it was damaged in the flooding that followed a burst pipe in his apartment the previous winter. 3 months before his stroke, as if the world were practicing, it had absorbed more of Gordon Aldrin than any photograph or document ever could. Catherine knew this in the wordless way you know things about a parent. She was not particularly musical herself. She worked in healthcare administration, managed budgets, sat in a lot of meetings about staffing levels and procurement cycles. She was practical by nature and by necessity, but she had grown up falling asleep to the sound of that violin coming through the wall of her childhood bedroom, and something about it had become the frequency she associated with the word safe. She hadn't told any of this to Leonard. She wasn't sure it was relevant, but she thought about it the whole drive back, and she thought about it again 2 weeks later, when he called to say he had the violin open, and he wanted to talk through what he was seeing before he went further. He used terms she didn't fully understand. She wrote them down anyway. She looked some of them up later. Mostly she listened to the tone of his voice, which was the same in conversation as it had been in that conservation room. Calm without being dismissive, precise without being cold. He told her the internal damage was more extensive than the visual inspection suggested, but that it was consistently extensive, meaning there were no hidden surprises that would change the prognosis. He told her the repair would take longer than a standard restoration. He told her his rate. She said yes to all of it. Over the following months, Leonard worked on the violin in the evenings after Pip went to bed. This was partly practical. The shop during the day was for paying jobs with deadlines, and the Aldrin violin required the kind of focused, unhurried attention that daytime shop work rarely allowed. But it was also something else. He found that he needed to be alone with it. Not lonely, alone. The way you're alone with something you're thinking through, very carefully. He had not taken on a project like this since Joanna died. In the years following, the work in the shop had been good and necessary but contained. Oil changes of the instrument world, functional repairs to get things playable again. The Aldrin violin was different. It asked him to remember things he had set aside. Techniques from his graduate work. Decisions that required genuine expertise rather than competent execution. Twice he drove to Fredericton to look at the 2 UNB instruments whose varnish formula he'd mentioned at the Institute. He took color samples under particular lighting conditions. He filled half a notebook with observations. Pip noticed the notebook, before she noticed much else. She was a careful observer, the way some children are, not precocious exactly, but attentive. She asked what he was working on one evening, and he showed her the violin in its current state. Top removed, interior bracing visible, the split block clamped with a configuration of go bars that made the instrument look like a patient in surgery. She looked at it for a long time. "Will it sound the same as before?" she asked. Leonard considered this honestly. "No instrument sounds exactly the same after a major repair," he said. "The wood changes, the way the pieces fit together changes slightly, but that's not always worse. Sometimes it's just different." Pip nodded as though this explained something she had been wondering about, that had nothing to do with the violin. She went back to her homework. Leonard watched her for a moment before returning to his work. He called Catherine every few weeks with updates. These calls started as practical reports, and gradually became something harder to categorize. She asked good questions, not technical ones. She admitted early on that she was taking notes, but only half understood them. But questions that got at meaning rather than mechanism. Why did the original maker choose spruce for the top instead of cedar? What made one instrument worth repairing while another wasn't? How did you know when you were done? Leonard found himself giving answers that were longer than strictly necessary. He hadn't talked about this kind of thing in a long time, not since his graduate seminars, probably. The conversations had a quality that was unusual to him. The feeling of thinking out loud with someone who was genuinely listening, rather than waiting for the information they'd called to receive. Once, late on a Wednesday night, Catherine mentioned that her father used to say the violin had a voice. Not metaphorically, he actually believed particular instruments had something like personality, something like preference. He claimed this one liked to be played slowly, that it resisted being hurried. Leonard sat with that for a moment. He wasn't wrong, he said. Older instruments with softer wood tend to, The way the top vibrates at lower frequencies becomes more pronounced. Playing slowly gives that resonance time to develop. He probably just understood the instrument. After 35 years you would. There was a pause on Catherine's end of the line. He would have liked talking to you, she said. Leonard didn't say anything to that right away. He looked at the violin on his workbench, partially reassembled now, holding its shape under the clamps like a question waiting to be answered. Tell me about the Tuesday sessions, he said. What music did he usually play? She talked for almost an hour. He listened. The restoration came to completion on a Thursday evening, in late March, 6 months after Leonard had first held the violin in the conservation room. He had re-glued and reinforced the split block. He had rehumidified and closed the top with a precision that left the repair line nearly invisible to the naked eye. He had rebuilt the missing section of the lower bout varnish in 4 layers over 6 weeks, adjusting the amber tone incrementally until the color aged into the surrounding finish, rather than contrasting with it. The pegs had been refitted. A new soundpost had been carved from a piece of spruce he had been storing for 3 years, waiting for the right use. He played it himself before calling Catherine. He was not a violinist, his instrument was the guitar, poorly, but he knew enough to draw the bow across the strings in first position and listen to what came back. The sound that came out of that workshop, at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night in Truro, with the space heater ticking, and the fluorescent light humming, and Pip, upstairs in Adele's house, 2 streets over, was something Leonard had not expected even after months of preparation. Full and dark in the low register. Responsive at the top of the bow stroke. The split in the block had, against all logic, become a slight structural feature that gave the instrument a particular character in the middle register. A warmth that wasn't there in the before photographs he'd taken of similar instruments. It did not sound the same as before. It sounded like itself, which is different and better. He sat on his stool for a long time after that, not thinking about anything specific, just sitting with it. He called Catherine the next morning. She drove to Truro 2 days later. He had expected a quick handoff. She'd see the violin, he'd walk her through what he'd done, she'd thank him and leave. That was how these things usually worked. Instead she sat in the orange vinyl chair for 2 hours, while he explained every repair, every decision, every point at which the project had been harder than anticipated. She asked about the varnish. She asked about the block. She asked him to show her, with a mirror and a flashlight, what the interior of the instrument looked like now, versus what he'd found when he first opened it. He showed her. She studied it with the focused attention of someone learning a new language. At the end of it, she picked up the violin and held it. Not to play, just to hold, and her face did something complicated and then settled. I need to ask you something, she said, and you can absolutely say no. He waited. My father played at a community concert every year in April. It's a small thing, a church hall in Antigonish, maybe 200 people, it benefits the local food bank. He did it for 22 years in a row. They're still doing it this year. There's a friend of his who plays fiddle who was going to perform in his place, but she told me that if the violin could be fixed, she'd play this one. In his memory. Catherine looked down at the case. It won't be ready in time unless someone brings it to Antigonish in 2 weeks. Leonard looked at his workbench, then at the violin, then at Catherine. I can bring it, he said, I should be there anyway, in case anything needs adjustment on the day. She looked up at him. You don't have to. I know, he said. He brought Pip. He hadn't planned to. But she asked if she could come when he mentioned the concert. And he couldn't think of a good reason to say no. She sat in the 3rd row of the church hall in Antigonish on a Saturday afternoon in April, wearing her winter coat, because the heating in the old building was ambitious but inconsistent, and she held her father's toolkit bag on her lap, in case he needed it. The church was more crowded than 200 people. Closer to 300 by the time the doors closed, because word had spread through the kitchen party circuit in the particular way that word spreads in rural Nova Scotia, which is fast and thorough and personal. People came who had played music with Gordon Aldrin for decades. Some of them had driven an hour and a half. There were people in their 70s, sitting beside people who looked barely older than Pip, the woman who played the violin. A retired school teacher named Francis, who had learned fiddle in the same kitchen parties as Gordon, who had known him for 40 years. walked out carrying the restored instrument, with the careful hands of someone who understood what she was holding. She adjusted the shoulder rest. She rosened the bow. She played one open string, listened, adjusted the fine tuner on the E, listened again, then she began to play. The piece was a slow air that Leonard didn't recognize. He found out afterward it was something Gordon had composed himself, over several years, never named it, played it only at this concert, and occasionally at sessions, when he thought nobody was listening too carefully. Francis had learned it from him by ear. The way you learn things that were never written down. The sound that came out of the violin was the sound Leonard had heard alone in his workshop at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, but it was also completely different, because the music that went into it was human and specific, and weighted with 35 years of Tuesday evenings and Saturday sessions. And a man who believed an instrument had preferences, and played it slowly, because it liked that. The low register bloomed the way he'd known it would. The warmth in the middle carried through the hall without amplification. People in the third row, and the eighth row, and standing along the back wall became very still. Pip, beside Leonard, didn't move. She was watching Francis play with the focused expression she used for things she was trying to understand completely. After a while she leaned slightly toward her father, without taking her eyes off the stage. "Is that the one you fixed?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He said. She nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else, but she reached sideways and found his hand without looking and held onto it, and Leonard let her, and they sat like that until the piece ended, and the hall came back to itself in a long exhale of breath, and then, after a beat, applause that started quietly and grew. Catherine was in the front row. Leonard watched her from where he sat. He saw the moment the music got through, whatever she had been holding closed since August, since the hospital, since the drive to the auction house. The moment it found the frequency she associated with the word safe. She didn't fall apart, she just let herself feel it. There's a difference, and it mattered. After the concert, in the foyer with bad coffee and oatmeal cookies, Frances held the violin out to Leonard with both hands. "Whatever you did," she said, "you gave it its voice back." Leonard held the violin carefully. "It had its own voice," he said, "I just made sure there was nothing in the way of it." He said it plainly, the way he said most things. But standing there in the foyer of a church hall in Antigonish, with 300 people talking quietly around him, and his daughter eating her second oatmeal cookie, with the focused satisfaction she brought to anything worth doing, Leonard Voss understood something he hadn't had language for, since Joanna died. Not that grief ends. It doesn't, particularly. Not that things go back to what they were, they don't. But that what comes after the damage, if you're patient and careful and honest about what you're working with, doesn't have to be lesser. It can be different in the way that matters. It can be more itself than it was before. Pip found him 20 minutes later with a third cookie and a look of mild concern. "We should probably head back," she said. "Adele is making chili." "Right," Leonard said. He put the violin case gently under his arm. "Let's go." They walked out into the April evening together, the parking lot, still half full, with cars belonging to people who had known Gordon Aldrin for 40 years, and come from an hour and a half away, on a Saturday afternoon, to be in a room where his music played one more time. The sky over Antigonish was that particular color it gets in late April. Not quite winter blue and not quite spring, something in between that hasn't decided yet. Leonard opened the truck and put the violin case as seat. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the door. Some things that look beyond saving aren't. Sometimes all they need is someone willing to look long enough to see what's still there. He got in the truck. Pip was already buckled and looking at her phone. He started the engine and the heater decided, for once, to work.